Howdy, everyone. We have a new topic here that we're beginning. Topic 15, environmental stressors. So we've spoken indirectly about some of the topics that'll come up here, but if you remember all the way back to some of the first things we talked about with system modeling, we talked about how the environmental factors are something that a human factors engineer might have design input over. Let's redesign the environment around our human workers so we can get, so we can make sure we're getting the most out of them. They're safe and effective. All right, so let's go on here. So we're going to talk about three different types of environmental stressors that are typically under the control of a workplace manager or management, right? So to some extent, at least, right? Sometimes based on the, place in the world or the nature of the work, you're just going to have these stressors, and you're going to have people that can either deal with them or you compensate them to deal with them. Well, I guess both, right? So we'll break up the subtopics in this lecture, in this topic, around these three subcategories here. So the first one, we'll talk about motion stressors. In 15.2, we'll talk about air quality, and then we'll talk about thermal stresses as well. So working in environments that are too hot or too cold, or the implications for weather conditions and climate on people's health and longevity and work effectiveness. Okay. All right, so 15.1, motion stressors. All right. So there are a lot of domains of work that involve motion all the time, consistently, through the course of the shift, you might be moving, whether that's, by nature of the environment you're in or by nature of the job. I can imagine, this vehicle is more or less continuously moving. That's why we have this convenient place to stand on the back. And sometimes, your whole body may be moving and you are getting the visual input of your whole body moving and the sensory input, from what you hear things around you and what you feel of the forces acting on your body. You get a sense for my body is moving around, right? Sometimes too much motion, just getting shook up, is enough to get people, into trouble with these motion stressors. Sometimes it just needs to be visual, or just needs to be a mismatch between what our vision is receiving and some of our other senses. And this is increasingly the case. I'll talk a little bit about how virtual reality is increasingly part of work, right? Not just fun or games or play, right? This is, potentially the environment where we're training people, for important, and complicated sorts of jobs, right? And so if people are susceptible to a lot of visual imagery motion that doesn't necessarily match their body motion, their expected other sensory inputs, we can have troubles. As it goes, there's a significant portion of the population, and I have family members. Two of the four in my family are headaches and this kind of thing when riding in the car, if we don't get things just right. And so I know they're very susceptible to it. But 33% of the general population have some form of motion sickness, even, like in just mild conditions. So just trying to read in the back seat while riding in a car. Third of us have trouble with that. Not me, I don't, but most people, once you crank up the motion to, something we'd call more severe conditions, but, still realistic ones you may encounter in the workplace, most people are going to start to have troubles with this. So it's not that some people are fully immune from motion sickness, it's just that you haven't been shooken up enough yet. Okay, so we had a pretty extensive topic 2 on vision. And so explaining the eye anatomy and how that ultimately becomes visual perception. This is another sense, you may call it that, the term human sense is sort of an ambiguous thing, but another sensory input that our brain uses for, is this body moving? is our acceleration basically senses, which are basically contained in the inner ear. So yeah, we also talked about the ear and how the cochlea here is where we encode different pitches, different sounds of different frequencies in the audible spectrum. You may remember we watched a video on that. But this same connected organ also includes these X, Y, and Z semicircular canals, and there is fluid in these canals. And as the fluid reacts to the gravity vector or to bodily accelerations, that fluid sloshes around, and the pattern of that fluid movement is how your body primarily senses accelerations. Okay, so with your head, with your eyes closed and your head shaking back and forth, that acceleration that you're feeling is your inner ear at work. All right, so we'll call this this is the vestibular system. I'd love to go into more detail on that, but I think this is enough for now, just to say, hey, this is input to the brain that says your body is moving, and this is how. All right, well, most of the time, our eyes give us visual input. There's things moving around, and our vestibular system gives us the sensation of forces, or the sensation of accelerations, I should say. And most of the time they match, and that's a good thing, because then you can reinforce, I'm seeing with my eyes the movement of my visual scene that is concurrent with what my other senses are telling me. Also my hearing, I've got some spatial awareness and movement awareness from my audio senses, my auditory senses. But usually these match, right? When they don't, that's when we have different forms of motion sickness. This is a real. I took this picture. That's the sick sack is like, I guess they claim the original motion sickness bag, that they would pack in like old timey aircraft in the pilot's flight kit, right? All right, there you go. Okay, so there's different types of this sickness. There's all kinds of different types of. But it all boils down to, am I a mismatch between my visual input and my vestibular input. For the most part, you can describe all of these as some version of a mismatch, right? Either my eyes are getting a lot of data and telling me I'm moving, and my vestibular system isn't, like in these cases, or vice versa. Okay, so if I'm seeing motion, but I'm not feeling it, space sickness is a very good example of this. So if I'm in microgravity, number one, I don't have that this way is down gravity vector, to kind of have that internal sense for which way is down and which way is up. You maybe don't think about this, but that's a really important orienting thing, right? Without that, it can be very disorienting, to the point that, even when people know that they're in space and everything, their unconscious body's freaking out a little bit, right? So without that vestibular input, if your eyes then are giving you input that you're moving around, which you are easily moving around in this space because of the microgravity, you're floating around, we can very easily get to a mismatch where there's a lot of visual evidence that says, hey, I'm moving around, maybe even moving fast, but I have very little of what I'm expecting from my sensory input to tell me that my body is moving. And for those of you, I know we have some, frequently we have students who are working in the space industry, so I always get to hear some cool stories. But you may have heard of this training device, which is used for, astronauts, for those who are going to be scientists in space. They need to be trained, because it's not like we can say, well, you're the best scientist in the world for this, or astronaut, but you get sick. I mean, I guess that could be a factor in deciding whether or not someone's a good astronaut. But in any case, you can be trained to some extent to deal with this mismatch. And there are a number of ways to do that I won't get into right now. I'll give a few examples at the end. But you may have heard of this training device, or basically, giving people the ability to get used to the feeling of weightlessness, as you would, in microgravity. and they have this aircraft which flies these parabolas so that, it's all hollow inside, and then the, aspiring or training astronauts can, feel the effects of microgravity and practice different maneuvers. And of course, this is where people frequently start to get sick for the first time with that sort of experience. And so they call it, say it with me, the vomit comet. That's right. All right. So there you go. So space sickness, that's one form of when motion is very present, but I'm not feeling that vestibular input. And so that's where my mismatch comes from. So other more common, maybe, because not many of us have been to space, would be when you have really wide field of view motion pictures, but you yourself are not moving. So, some people get this, especially with IMAX movies. And the more motion you have in the movie, where your field of view is such that the entire field of view, for the most part, is the moving imagery. So you don't have this ability to like separate and think that's a screen. Your eyes are telling you you are moving, your body is moving. There's no evidence of the edges of the screen for this to be an artificial reality, right? I'm personifying our senses now, but I hope you get what I mean. If there isn't an obvious sign that this is generated imagery, your eyes are telling your brain, hey, we're moving, along with this imagery, right? And so another example, like found footage videos. There was a period of time when I was in high school, I saw this movie, and this is the Blair Witch Project, kind of the first, the first time when people said, had this kind of movie. And I remember, like, we thought it was real and everything, it was great. But the idea of, running through the forest with a handheld camera and then making that into a movie, it wasn't really well known, or really didn't reach that much of the population until we had this very popular movie that used that filming style. Suddenly, a lot of people are getting sick in the theater due to motion sickness. So for the first time, they're having this very large screen, and it's so jostling the source of the image, people have trouble with it. Nowadays, so, virtual reality simulators are getting increasingly immersive. And so if you have a combination of sensory inputs that are telling your brain, I'm moving, or I'm moving, things are moving around me, but your vestibular sense is lacking, this is going to be this sort of a motion sickness situation. And so like I said, with virtual reality, and you have like immersive audio cues, the more sensory input that doesn't match my vestibular input, the more this could be problematic. Some people are relatively less affected by it, but ultimately that mismatch is not something brains like. So what do we do if we really want to study very realistic and not get people, too affected by a mismatch here in like a simulation environment? And so we do have motion-based simulators, and I like to use this opportunity to point out, my alma mater, the University of Iowa. I have a lot of love for it. They also have, and have had for years, the most sophisticated motion-based driving simulator in the world. And so if you can imagine, interior of this, sort of shell here, they have a full vehicle that is then, top of the line graphics, and generated scenery, and it's using a real chassis and everything, for the, for how it feels and everything, and the controller. And then this entire, cab here will literally move, in what we call 16 degrees of motion, for 16 degrees of freedom. So it can create all the pitch, roll, yaw, X, Y, Z, every dynamic that you might naturally experience on the roadway, it can fairly reliably recreate that. I've never myself ridden in it; it's too expensive. But I know this is the kind of technology we can use. Well, hey, if we're having trouble with mismatched vestibular input, let's make the vestibular input realistic. Let's make it match, right? And then people have much less trouble with this. Okay, so now we're vice versa. There are also conditions where we feel motion, but we don't have the visual input to match that. So the classic example is reading in a car. Okay, my daughter's sitting in the back seat. She's reading her book on the road trip. Oh, she starts to get a headache. She starts to feel sick. This is my wife's side of the family. They have that. They have quite a bit of it, and it's very common, right? So, and the idea is your eyes are focused on this paper, which is not moving. Your field of view is your book, and so according to your visual input, your world is not moving. But according to your vestibular system, you're in a moving car. You're feeling every little bump. You're bumping off. So there's where the mismatch occurs. And so what is the, what's the solution? Those of you out there who suffer from this, it's to, okay, put your book down and look out the window. And what you're doing is you're reinforcing visually the motion of the vehicle to match up with your vestibular input. You're letting those two senses resynchronize, basically. So yeah, look out the window if you have trouble reading while in a moving car. This is also why air sickness, seasickness for sure, and air sickness to a lesser extent. But if you can't see outside, imagine being below deck in a cruise ship, or being in an aircraft and being in the middle row, and not having a good window view, and the aircraft is moving. If your body is moving and you're feeling that sense, but your world around you visually stays consistent, because the entire vehicle is moving, then we have a mismatch there. So, and then, this sensation of getting dizzy. So the way we do this is, we can get that fluid going in our vestibular canals there, our semicircular canals, and can really get those senses, or those sensory receptors there kind of fired up, right? And then when we stop, the dizziness is that continued sort of re-slosh circulation of that fluid. And that can cause our brain to temporarily feel like there is more body motion than there truly is. So we can have sort of the illusion of motion in our vestibular system. That could be the motion felt, but we don't see a motion that corresponds with it. So that's kind of what's going on when we feel dizzy like that, by putting our head on a bat and spinning around. All right. What can we do about it? So, there's a number of really cool, technological ways that are being, sort of looked at and proposed. I don't know a whole lot about it, but I did come across these glasses, and my wife had thought for a while about getting some to try them out, but gave up. I'd be curious if anybody has tried them, but these actually include, colored fluid in these sorts of, in these, in the glasses, so that when there is any sort of acceleration of the car, you are getting movement here. So even if you're if you're looking and staying, relatively focused on a static book that you're reading, your eyes are still getting visual input to match your vestibular input. So there's some evidence that this sort of glasses help. Also, I've heard with space sickness, some glasses that kind of strobe, and I don't exactly know how this helps, but there is some, I want to say, maybe it helps people sort of dissociate the visual field from, the lack of the vestibular input. So I'm not sure how that works, but I know that, either in a training or treatment sense, those strobe glasses have been effective. And then, and of course you can always, if your vestibular system is telling you you're moving, seek visual input that also tells you you're moving. If your vestibular system is saying you're not moving and your vision is saying you're moving, close your eyes. That's the easiest way. Make the two match as best you can, and then that you can overcome the discomfort, or the there can be nausea, there can be eye strain, there can be headaches. It happens to everybody. Your brain doesn't like it, and it manifests that dislike in a lot of ways. All right, and then finally, medication. It exists out there. Dramamine. My dad he's got the Dramamine ready whenever he flies. Those are prescription and over the counter. And ginger, for whatever reason, ginger is a particularly good treatment for at least the nausea-based aspects of motion sickness. And that's it. Thanks. That's topic 15.1.